A manager reads one article about a competitor's data breach and wants to triple the security budget by Friday. A manager watches one factory fire on the news and schedules emergency fire drills for next week. Neither reaction has anything to do with the real odds of either event happening to their own company. Both come from something much shallower, whatever happened to be sitting fresh in memory that morning. This is the availability heuristic, and it is quietly wrecking prioritization inside companies every single week. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut where people judge how likely something is by how easily examples come to mind, not by the actual numbers behind it. If a risk is vivid, recent, or emotionally charged, your brain files it as common and urgent. If a risk is slow, quiet, and never makes headlines, your brain files it as rare, even when the opposite is true. Notice what that actually means for a manager sitting in a planning meeting. You are not comparing two risks on their merits. You are comparing how easily each one can be pictured. A headline about a rival's disaster arrives complete with a mental image already built for you. A hacked server, a burning building, a furious customer. A quiet, ongoing risk usually arrives as a number on a spreadsheet, with no image attached at all. The heuristic isn't weighing danger. It's weighing which risk came with better packaging. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman documented this pattern decades ago, and their work still explains a huge share of bad prioritization inside organizations today. Tversky and Kahneman were interested in a simple question. When people estimate frequency or probability, what process are they actually running in their heads? The honest answer, backed by their research, is that most people are not running a frequency calculation at all. They are running a much cheaper operation instead. How easily can I think of an example of this? Whatever answer that easier operation produces gets treated as if it were the answer to the harder question. One of their classic demonstrations asked people to judge whether more English words begin with the letter K or have K as the third letter instead. Most people confidently said more words start with K. The actual answer is the opposite. Words with K in the third position are more common. People got it backwards because words starting with K are much easier to retrieve from memory. Your brain can search by first letter far more easily than by third letter. So recall speed masqueraded as evidence about real frequency. That single result captures the whole mechanism. Ease of retrieval gets mistaken for likelihood, even in a domain where the true numbers are checkable and stable. Kahneman later described this kind of substitution as a difference between two modes of thinking: a fast, automatic, intuitive mode, and a slower, deliberate, effortful one. Estimating a real probability correctly usually requires the slow mode, gathering data, checking a base rate, doing arithmetic most people would rather avoid in a meeting. The fast mode doesn't do any of that. It reaches for whatever comes to mind first and hands you an answer instantly, with total confidence, and no warning label attached telling you the answer might be wrong. Most workplace decisions get made under exactly the conditions where the fast mode takes over: time pressure, incomplete information, and a room full of people who all want an answer now, not after someone runs the numbers. The same substitution shows up constantly in how people assess danger and risk in daily life. Events that are dramatic, visually striking, or heavily covered by media become far easier to recall than events that are common but boring. This is why people so often rate spectacular but rare causes of harm as more probable than mundane but frequent ones. It isn't stupidity, it's a functioning cognitive shortcut, operating exactly as designed, just pointed at the wrong target now. The shortcut likely evolved because for most of human history, what was easy to recall really was correlated with what was common in your immediate environment. If a threat kept coming to mind, it was usually because that threat was genuinely present nearby. That correlation breaks down completely in a modern information environment, where a single vivid story can reach millions of people who have zero personal exposure to the actual event, and where media coverage tracks drama, not statistical frequency. Inside a company, this creates a strange and consistent pattern in leadership meetings. The risk that gets discussed is not the risk with the highest actual probability. It is the risk somebody just read an article about, or the risk that happened to someone they know, or the risk with the most vivid mental image attached to it. A single dramatic customer complaint that goes viral on social media can trigger more urgent action in a single afternoon than a slow, steady decline in customer satisfaction scores that nobody has been watching closely for the past 2 quarters. The angry post is vivid, specific, and easy to picture. It has a face, a screenshot, a share count. The declining trend line, by contrast, is abstract, cumulative, and easy to ignore. A slope on a chart nobody opened this week, even though the trend line is very often the one carrying the larger real cost. Notice what actually happens in the meeting once the viral complaint comes up. Someone pulls it up on their phone. The room reacts to it the way a room reacts to any story, with attention, urgency, a felt sense that something must be done right now. Nobody pulls up the satisfaction trend line with the same energy, because a trend line doesn't produce that same jolt. It just sits there, quietly getting worse, one data point at a time, none of them individually alarming enough to interrupt a meeting on its own. By the time the accumulated decline is large enough to feel as urgent as the viral complaint did, it has usually been getting worse for months, sometimes years, entirely unaddressed, while the organization's attention kept getting captured by whatever vivid thing happened most recently. Here's a version of that same distortion most operations teams will recognize immediately. IT outage response. When a system goes down in a highly visible, customer-facing way, with executives fielding phone calls and a support queue flooding in real time, the response is fast, resourced, and total. War rooms get created, engineers get pulled off other projects, post-incident reviews get scheduled within days, sometimes with a slide deck for the executive team. That response is often exactly right for that specific outage. The distortion shows up in what happens next. Teams frequently overinvest in defending against a repeat of that exact scenario, hardening the specific failure mode that just embarrassed everyone, adding monitoring, adding approval steps, adding redundancy aimed squarely at the one thing that already happened, while a much less dramatic but more frequent category of small, quiet, only partially diagnosed slowdowns keeps draining engineering time month after month without ever triggering an incident review. The vivid outage gets a task force and a follow-up meeting cadence. The chronic, boring latency issue that costs more cumulative engineering hours across the quarter gets a shrug and a backlog ticket that nobody schedules because it never produced one unforgettable afternoon of panic. Hiring decisions show the same bias from a different angle. One bad hire, especially one who caused visible damage, an ugly client interaction, a public mistake, a difficult exit, tends to reshape an entire hiring process for years afterward. Suddenly, every candidate faces an extra round of interviews built specifically to screen for whatever trait that one person had. That instinct is not irrational on its face, but it is disproportionate. A single vivid failure gets weighted, as if it revealed a systemic flaw in the entire hiring approach, while the much larger and quieter pattern, dozens of solid, unremarkable hires who worked out fine, gets no attention at all because it never produced a memorable story. The company ends up optimizing its hiring process around preventing a repeat of one vivid anecdote, rather than around the actual track record of hire quality across its full history. But here's the part nobody expects. Fixing this is not about training people to feel less scared. Fear is not the malfunction here. The malfunction is using fear as a measurement tool. You cannot argue someone out of a vivid memory, and you shouldn't try. What you can do is put a better instrument next to the feeling before a decision gets made, so the vivid story has to compete with something colder and more complete than a headline. Here's a line worth sitting with, because it isn't in any textbook. The businesses that are best at avoiding this trap are not the ones with the calmest leaders. They are the ones with the most boring reporting habits. Calm leaders still get spooked by a vivid story. What actually protects an organization is having the unglamorous numbers already sitting on a dashboard before the scary story ever shows up, so there is something dull and reliable to check the panic against. Safety incidents follow this same script almost exactly. A single visible safety incident, a fall, a near miss caught on camera, an injury that makes it into a report senior leadership actually reads, can trigger sweeping new procedures, new mandatory trainings, new sign-off requirements, sometimes overnight, sometimes before the incident report itself is even finished. Meanwhile, a chronic, under-resourced hazard, a maintenance backlog, a known equipment issue, a process gap that safety staff have flagged quietly for months in emails nobody escalated, can sit unaddressed because it has never yet produced its own dramatic incident. The organization is not indifferent to safety. It is responding to salience instead of frequency. The dramatic incident is a sample size of one, but it feels like proof, the way a single vivid anecdote always does. The chronic hazard has a much larger track record of near misses and smaller failures behind it, but because none of those individually made headlines, they never accumulate the same emotional weight in a meeting, even though, added together, they may represent the larger, actual danger sitting inside the building. This matters because attention and budget inside any organization are both finite. Every hour spent responding to the vivid, available risk is an hour that is not being spent on the quiet, statistically larger one. Leadership time is a scarce resource, and the availability heuristic is constantly trying to allocate that scarce resource based on what is memorable rather than what is likely. Left unchecked, this produces an organization that is extremely responsive to whatever happened most recently and most dramatically, and chronically under-responsive to whatever has been quietly compounding in the background the entire time. The fix is not to ignore vivid stories. It is to separate what's memorable from what's actually likely every single time before money or attention moves. In practice, that means building one habit into how your team reacts to any scary story. Before reallocating resources, ask for the base rate. A base rate is simply the actual frequency of an event across the whole relevant dataset, not just the one example everyone in the room is currently talking about. It's the boring denominator sitting underneath the dramatic numerator. Here's what that looks like concretely, using the security budget example from the very start. A competitor's breach hits the news. Before approving a tripled security budget, ask a specific question. Across our own company's actual incident logs, over the past several years, how often have we had breach attempts, near misses, or verified intrusions? And how does that frequency compare to other categories of operational risk competing for the same budget? That single question does not dismiss the competitor's breach as irrelevant. It puts it in context next to everything else fighting for the same dollars. Sometimes the base rate will confirm the scary story was pointing at something real and underfunded. Often, it will show that the vivid story simply won the room because it was recent and dramatic, not because it represented the company's largest actual exposure. Either way, the decision that follows is now based on evidence, instead of on whichever headline happened to land that week. The same question works for every scenario above. For the IT outage, ask how many total hours per quarter go to the dramatic outage category versus the chronic slowdown category, measured across logs, not memory. For hiring, ask what share of hires over the last several years actually caused serious problems versus how many quietly worked out fine before redesigning the entire interview process around one anecdote. For the safety incident, ask how many total near misses and smaller incidents the flagged, unaddressed hazard has already generated, compared to the one dramatic event that triggered this week's meeting. In every case, the base rate question forces the conversation to move from the one loud data point to the full quiet dataset sitting underneath it. There's a practical order of operations worth building into how any team handles this. First, let the vivid story trigger a question, not a decision. A scary headline or a bad incident is a perfectly good reason to go look something up. It is a bad reason to sign off on a budget in the same meeting it was raised in. Second, pull the actual log, ticket, history, or incident record before the next meeting, not from memory and not from whoever in the room has the strongest opinion. Memory is exactly the input that got distorted in the first place, so it cannot be the thing you check the distortion against. Third, put the vivid example and the base rate side by side on the same page, so the room can see both the story and the numbers at the same time, instead of only ever seeing whichever one happened to be raised most recently. Fourth, make the resourcing decision based on the comparison, not on whichever input arrived first or loudest. None of this means vivid stories should be banned from the room, or that a competitor's breach, a bad hire, or a safety incident isn't worth discussing. It means a vivid story should be treated as a prompt to go check the data, never as a substitute for it. The story tells you where to look. The base rate tells you how urgently and how much to act. The practical takeaway for any manager is this: build the base rate question into your standard response to any urgent, dramatic request for resources. Ask it before the meeting ends, not after the budget is already spent. Vivid stories are excellent at getting a meeting scheduled. They are terrible at telling you whether that meeting deserves your budget. Do this consistently, and over time your team stops reacting to whichever story happened to be loudest that week and starts building a genuine habit of checking the quiet numbers before the money moves. That's the real shift. Not colder decision-making, just decision-making that finally matches the actual risk sitting inside the business, instead of the risk that simply happened to make the news. If that changed how you see your team, follow for more.